Welcome to the Profile Corner. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at what I've got here on the workbench and hopefully assembling this into something that's useful. Back in the 1980s, I purchased from Sears a device called a Pantograph that worked with a router. And I thought that was the neatest thing ever when I had it on order and I got it home. And then I started experimenting with it, and I couldn't quite figure out why the device is so special. So I've got here the raw materials for producing another Pantograph. This one requires some assembly, it appears. And I found some directions on the internet that tell how to put this together. Mattias Wandell has a good set of plans on his website. I purchased those plans, and I thought that I would put this together. The bad news is that this 3/4 inch piece of Baltic Birch Plywood that's 5 feet by 5 feet was roughly $74 with tax. And that's more than what it costs to buy the current Milescraft Pantograph through Amazon, if I recall correctly. There's various other companies that had offered Pantographs in the past for routers. Those included Milescraft, Sears Craftsman, Klingspor, Vermont American, Black & Decker, and there's also a few other companies that created Pantographs out of cast iron. And those are rather heavy-duty units that were probably a little more expensive than the unit that I bought back in the 1980s. And they look like they're a little more useful. So anyway, I'm going to be adapting the plans that Mattias Wandell created to use what I've got here. I'll be using a rail that looks like this for the templates. Here's a sample template that I 3D printed. This is a spiral template. I'll bring it up closer to the camera so that it's easier for you to see. And essentially, it just goes around and around. Maybe what I can do is I can put together a video that shows how I created this using freehand. It has alignment blocks on the back side. Unfortunately, this rail uses a slightly different width here than what I was expecting. I was expecting these slots to be 4.2 millimeters across. Unfortunately, these are about 6.5 millimeters, or a little bit less than that. And so this will be a little bit sloppy on there, but I think with the screws locking it down in place, it'll be okay. So I also have some other 3D printed templates that I created that I figured that I would be able to use these with the Pantograph. And some of these should be interesting. And of course, some of the problems that you're going to have with a Pantograph is that it ends up tilting the cutting bit into the wood as the Pantograph comes down. And so that could be a problem, and it could end up mixing up some of these patterns so that they don't look quite so nice. So I figured that I would do that, and then I would also try to add some dust collection onto it using maybe this skirt. And of course I'd have to cut the skirt down a bit. And here's the router that I'll be using. This is a Bosch palm router, and just one that I picked up a year or two ago for about $100. And then also I've got here some clear filament for my 3D printer. I may be able to use this to 3D print some of the parts that I'm going to need for the dust collection to work right. And unfortunately, Mattias's plans are all in metric. He supplied the drawings so that you could convert them all over to inches, but they won't convert over evenly. And so I ended up having to buy a metric tape measure to go along with the project. I've taped together the individual pages in Mattias's plan so that they're correctly assembled together. And what I was thinking is that while he says that some of these parts should be cut out of hard maple, I do have hard maple, but it appears as though because I've got a 5 foot by 5 foot sheet of Baltic Birch Plywood here, then I can actually get all of the pieces out of a small strip of this sheet of plywood without too much difficulty. I will have some challenge running this over the table saw, so I think what I may do is just take my handheld circular saw and make a cut right down through here, and that'll cut this piece off, and then I can refine the cuts over at the table saw more easily. Now for $12 US, this plan is rather detailed, which is very nice to see. I'm just going to clean up the edge using the table saw here, cutting it down to a little bit over 9 7/8 wide. I've got a clean edge now. I want to clean up the other edge from the factory. Now I'll cross-cut the plywood for these curved parts. I've got a mark set up here, and I'm allowing a little bit of scrap on this end and an equal amount down here, maybe a little bit over 3/8 of an inch on each end. I think it'll work out best if I cut this board down so it's the same width as this width from here to here, and I'm measuring that out at 5 1/8 inches. So it looks like that while these plans are in metric, Mattias did try to use some imperial measurements here and there to make it easier to use the plan. I'm using UHU glue stick. This is a glue that Mattias had mentioned in his plans, that it's easy to remove, that's contrary to what it says here on the label, that it's strong and fast. curved parts, and these templates are peeling off pretty easily, so it looks like this is the right type of glue to use. I'm cutting these lines closer to the final dimension than what I usually would on the bandsaw. I'll probably clean these up a little bit at the oscillating spindle sander. Some of these cannot be cleaned up at the oscillating spindle sander because of the angles involved, but I'll take care of that next. I drilled out the 3/16 inch holes in the two parts here for the router mount, and I'm doing a test here using the 3/16 inch rods that I bought. These are actually measuring less than 3/16 of an inch. I'm supposed to be seeing 0.1875, and when I measure them, they're actually measuring roughly 0.183. So they're smaller than what they should be. According to what Mattias said in his plans, you actually do need to have them ever so slightly less than 3/16 of an inch so that the things will slide smoothly. So I guess this will work out in my favor. So I'm getting ready to glue the bottom router link and the middle router link layer together. So I'll just put some glue on here and get these clamped up, and then I'll start working on the straight parts, getting those cut. Okay, the straight wood parts need to be cut to 390 millimeters. So I've used my metric ruler here to mark that out. Looks like I can knock off a little bit. I'll leave it a little bit long, just in case this is not exactly new fence yet. It appears that these two lines here and here are roughly 129.41 millimeters apart. And so if I set up the rip fence to cut that width, maybe I'll make it 130, then I should be able to glue this template directly onto the board. This one here I don't need to glue onto the board because there's no internal cuts like you can see on these. Okay, the next section needs to be 60 millimeters wide. Next up, I'm going to cut out this section here from this board. Okay, now I need to cut this section off and this section off, this board. Cut the remaining piece down to 190 millimeters. Okay, now I need to cut this board down to this size here, which is supposed to be 60 millimeters, and I need to make two of these, and so I'm hoping that I can actually get two of these out, 60 millimeters here and then 60 millimeters here, so I can get two of those. I need to cut one of these boards to 60 millimeters, and since I've already got the rip fence set up to that, I can use that as a stop block. I need one that's at 75 millimeters. I need one at 130 millimeters. And the last one needs to be at 105 millimeters, and I need two of those. Okay, so next what I need to do is get these attached to the different boards, and then I can go over and do some bandsawing. I've already started drilling some of the holes. I need to drill some holes for screws also. And I've already taken this over to the bandsaw and to the drill press to drill the holes, as you can see there. And now I need to cut this down so that these are 30 millimeters wide, each one. I'll have to be real careful to make sure that I get that accurate, otherwise my ears are going to be compounding as I go across. I'm going to make a test cut to see if I've got it at exactly 300 millimeters. Actually at 29.91 millimeters. That'll probably be okay. really should have had a second push stick here instead of using my fingers coming up that close to the blade. I have several more parts that require work over here at the bandsaw, so I'm going to get started on that now. I have all the parts cut out now, as far as I'm aware. Unfortunately, the plan has cutouts here for 19mm thick Baltic Birch Plywood, and the Baltic Birch Plywood that I bought is only 18mm thick, so there's a 1mm gap here and also here. I need to finish getting this assembly glued up. I'll be doing that next, and then I'll be working on the glue up of the other assemblies. Now I need to wait for this assembly to dry for a little while, and then I can glue on the top portion. And of course I'll be using the rods to make sure that I have the holes properly aligned, top and bottom, when I glue this on. I'm getting ready to cut two 160mm rods that'll be the fixed Pantograph hinge. I've got a cutoff wheel on the angle grinder here, and I'm using blue tape to mark the location of where I need to cut. I have 3 of these to cut at 130mm long for the Pantograph hinges, and then of course I've got a couple others that I'll cut off camera. And then once I get all these cut, I'll clean up the ends using a regular bench grinder. I just have 2 of the 3 mounted into the bench vise right now because I couldn't get it to grip the third one at the same time. So I'm going to cut these 2 then, and then I'll cut the third one off camera. I'm getting ready to glue together the router mount link top layer onto the other assembly. I've installed some spare rods that I have into the holes for alignment, and then I'll glue this up, and then we'll move on to gluing up some of the other parts. I have the short link glued up here, and I'm getting ready to work on gluing up the follower link assembly. This one's going to be a little bit more complicated because I've got to position two pieces here and make sure that they stay centered on the boards. I've got the follower link glued up, and now I'm getting ready to glue up the long link bar. Just need to apply a little more glue and then clamp it up. And fortunately, I've got enough clamps to be able to do this. I have the pivot mount spacer and the pivot mount base glued up. Now I've got to check the directions to see what comes next. I have the pivoting assembly put together. That's about the only thing that I've put together so far. I did find that I had another part that needed to be glued on, and so I've glued it on, and then I've sanded down all the parts. So now we're to the point where we can begin the major assembly. There are still some holes that I need to drill for screws, and I'll be taking care of that soon. And then I've got to figure out how these pieces go together with the pins. And I've got the pins back here that are ready to go. I'm in the process of finalizing the router mounting clamp, and so what I've done is I've center punched the location of some holes for some 2.5 inch long screws that I've got here. And so then what I've done is I marked on here bottom and top, and then I've clamped the bottom one in place, and I drilled through a pilot hole that's just large enough for the center of that screw that I've got here. And so I've run the drill bit into this hole and into this hole, and then I put the top clamp in place, and I did the same thing there. And now I can take this off, and I can drill down as deep as I can go with this drill bit to create the pilot hole for those screws. I had a little bit of separation between the layers of the birch plywood when I drove in this screw, so I've pushed this in as far as it'll go so that it would open up that crack, and I applied some wood glue down in there, and then I backed the screw out, and I'm using this clamp to hold it tight, and then I push the screw back in to where it'll normally sit. So I'm letting that dry up. I'm starting to do the assembly here. I've got a diagram that was included in with the plans, and I've printed it out so that I can see how things are supposed to go together. So I've got here the pivot base, the pivot mount. This is the short link right here. That's this part here. And then I've got the long link is right here, and that goes underneath the short link. And so now I'm just putting the pin in. I applied a little bit of paste wax onto the pin at each of the locations where it's entering into the parts. And now I should be able to just hammer this down ever so gently. And now we're coming into where the second set of holes are at. It seems to be going in without a problem so far. I can't tell if it's made it all the way into this last piece down here yet or not. Okay, now I know it's made it into that piece. And now we're into the bottom piece here. I've gone just a little bit further. And I see it right there coming out, or almost coming out, the bottom. Okay, so that's put together. I should have probably put a little more paste wax right here and right here. But so I'm sure that that'll be okay. Okay, so now I'll go back to the drawing and I'll assemble this piece here, which is this, onto this point right here. Before I can do that, however, I need to drill a hole through here so that I can insert a bolt that will allow this to be clamped together. And this is where the follower point will be inserted through right here. So I'll be drilling out that hole next. Here I've got the 1/4 inch bolt set through there. It's actually a carriage bolt. And I've started inserting this pin into here. I've put paste wax down in here and also in here and also on the rod and also where the rod enters the holes. So now I just need to push that rod through. I could add on wooden knobs onto the top of these, as Mattias has in his plans. I may do that at a later time. And I could knock these pins out if necessary, or raise them up a little bit so that I can get the wooden knobs onto the top at a later time. Okay, so now we've got some of it here. This glue should be setting up soon, so I should be able to add that on. And there's 2 different holes down here. I've got to take a look at the directions here and see which holes need to be used for setting it up for half scale. The other holes would be used for 1/3 scale. I'm setting this pin in now. Okay, so now I just have one more to do here at this other end. And this says that I need to have it in the second from the end. So into this one here. And that goes to this hole right here. So I'll put some paste wax on that to get that ready to go. I hammered this rod down so that it's just barely poking through. That should help me find this hole. And there's into the hole. Now it's going into the bottom holes. Okay, so there's the assembly put together. And I'll have to know what the range of motion is for this so that I know where to mount this piece right here. And of course the 3D nature of this pantograph allows you to tip in and actually follow a 3-dimensional object out here. I'm trying to figure out what size sheet of plywood I need for the base of this unit. Mattias has a recommendation of 24 inches by 30 inches as being ideal. So what I've been doing here is I've laid out on the workbench with this thing centered at 20 inches from the edge of the workbench over here, because I was initially thinking that this unit can reach all the way over to the side here at its maximum extent, and then also it can reach almost to the front of the workbench at maximum extent. The trouble that we've got here though is that the path that the router is on will end up crossing over the path of where the template will have to be located. So if we look at this, the router, let's say that we go over to the right side or to the left side, the router ends up being with a collet roughly right here on the workbench. And over on the other side, as far back as we can go, the router ends up over here. And so that's suggesting that this is the furthest back that our piece that we'll be cutting into will be located. So that suggests that this will be the furthest back that we can cut into the board that's clamped onto the table. And when we're at that location here in the center, the template fouler is roughly where this piece of blue tape is at, right here. So we only have this small area here to play with, really. It's roughly maybe 5 inches or so. And so that means that our maximum travel here would actually be about 10 inches, which would put us out to about right here. So if we take the pointer out to about 10 inches, this would be the maximum right here before the router runs into where the template would be at, if the template starts right here. Okay, with that in mind, let's see what we have if we measure out to that point from the back. We're out to about 26 inches to the front here. Okay, so 26 inches. So let's say that we're going to go out to 28 inches to give a little bit of room here for a clamp to come in and secure our workpiece down. So 28 inches that way. So I'll write that down, 28 inches. And if we really look at this, we go over to the maximum point right here, which is where we're at right now with the router back as far as it'll go. We're actually 2.5 inches from there. Okay, so then 2.5 inches minus 20 inches puts us at 17.5 inches to the center point right here to reach right here. So 17.5 times 2 would be 35. So I get 28 by 35. So I think that that is the size that I'm going to make my work table. Okay, so now I've got a good idea of the size of the sheet of plywood that I need, which is a little bit larger by 4 inches in the one dimension and 5 inches in the other dimension than what Mattias recommended in his plans. So I'll have to get that cut out, and what I'm going to be doing is I'll be using some micro jig hardware rather than using a large custom made clamp like Mattias used here. I'll be using some micro jig hardware that I've used in other locations, such as in the tendoning jig. And then I also bought some other types of hold downs from micro jig. These are low profile hold downs. These are kind of expensive. I played around with one of these in the store over the weekend, and I thought, wow, that's kind of neat that you can actually apply pressure to the side and also downward using a ring like this. And so I'll be putting in dovetails into the piece of plywood. I've also got to get some sort of a finish applied onto this, and I need to make the template foulers. So I think what I'll do is I'll save those for the next video so that we have a chance to actually experiment with this once we get those last couple steps finished on this project. So that next video will be coming out in just a couple of days. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.